We've been talking a lot about the Keller Independent School District and this very unique proposal that's been pressed forward by their school board to divide the existing school district into an East Side district and a West Side district. Now, this has been an ongoing conversation now for the last couple of months, and it's been quite interesting, and it has really blown up on social media. And we've talked about it a little bit here, but I wanted to take a moment to break down the latest school board meeting that they've just recently had to continue this discussion about breaking up the school district. But I also wanted to take a moment to sort of discuss some of the points that were raised in the school board meeting and to talk a little bit about how do we even get to this point anyway with all the financial struggles happening in school districts in Texas. So let's talk about it. This is a school rules breakdown. Now, the latest Keller ISD board meeting happened on January 30th, 2025. It was a Thursday night, and they spent a lot of time opening up the meeting talking about financial issues. Their chief operating officer gave a really good overview of kind of how Keller got to this point where they're having some financial troubles. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what that means and how most school districts are actually in a similar spot. So I want to talk about how do we even get to this point. Keller is talking about this split being a possible reason to help mitigate some of these financial issues that the district is having. But Keller did a really good job of talking about where they are financially to give the public sort of a sense of the deficits that they're having right now. But this is not an uncommon struggle for many school districts across the state of Texas. In fact, about 85% of all school districts in the state of Texas right now are operating with deficit budgets. They just don't have enough money to do the job that they need to do. And the question you're probably asking is, why? Where's all that money? Well, there's a lot of factors, so let's break down each one. One of them is, and this is a huge concern for everybody, is inflation. Since 2019, inflation's up about 23%. So that means things just naturally cost more. And if you don't have any more money, then it's going to be more expensive to operate your school district. So that's one major issue. Another major issue is a lot of the COVID money that was given by the federal government is starting to go away. School districts use some of that money as a stopgap to help ease some of their financial concerns. So now that COVID money is starting to disappear, there is a huge hole in the budget that school districts are now looking for to try to fill. Now, another reason, and this is a huge reason, and a lot of school districts have been talking about this, is that in school finance world, what happens is school districts get an allotment per student, and it's a minimum allotment. It's around $6,000, and that's set by the state. It's set by the lawmakers in Austin. That allotment has not kept pace with inflation. In fact, it hasn't been raised since 2019. So a lot of school districts are operating their budgets on 2019 levels. That means they're operating on their finances and paying teachers and running their school district on what's been allotted to them from 6 years ago. And it's bad enough to know that a lot of school districts, all school districts, in fact, have to operate their budgets that are always 2 years behind the legislature because that's the nature of funding things in the state of Texas. Because Texas only meets once every 2 years, the budget that school districts operate on is always 2 years behind. So the state legislature is in session now for 2025, and they'll be meeting until May, and they will be proposing the budget for the next 2 years. So school districts can't legally plan what they're going to do for their finances until the summertime. So, and that's one of the two major things that school boards can do is they set the budget and they set the tax rate. So because the allotment hasn't been raised, there has been some concerns about where do school districts get their money in order to just operate from a day-to-day basis. Now, last and not least, and certainly probably the most important, is that in the last legislative session, the 88th legislative session, there was a pot of money that was designated for school districts, and it's just their natural, normal funding that they were supposed to get for that school year. It was around $4.5 billion, and that $4.5 billion would be disseminated to all school districts for their operating budgets. However, because there has been a push in this state to fund a voucher program, and because that voucher program did not pass in the last session, the money that school districts were supposed to receive was held back. The legislature didn't disseminate that money, and they kept it as a way to sort of encourage legislators to pass that voucher bill. Now, the voucher bill did not pass, and as a result, that money was held by the state government, and it wasn't given to school districts. And school districts then had to scramble and find a way to continue their operating budgets after not being funded properly in the 88th legislative session. So now that we're in the 89th session here in 2025, that same voucher bill has been pushed forward, and that same amount of money that carried over from the 88th session is now up for grabs, and hopefully the legislature will then release that money like they're supposed to. But the reality is that 2 years ago, school districts didn't get the money that they were promised. So as a result, school districts had to scramble, borrow from their fund balances, and look for other ways like cutting programs, closing schools, reducing teachers and staff in order to fix this financial problem. So what I'm saying is that Keller is struggling, but other school districts are struggling too. So let's talk about how long has this been going on and what have school districts been doing to try to get past this financial problem. Now, I've been in the school business for 25 years, and I'll be the first to admit that the school finance funding formula in Texas is very broad, comprehensive, and very complicated. So there's a lot of things that happen with WADA and funding formulas and Robin Hood and recapture. There's all these terms that get thrown around. But the reality is that we're dealing with a pot of money, and there's actually two different pots of money, and I don't want to get into all that. But the pot of money that Keller's talking about in their board meeting is the M&O, which is maintenance and operation. Now, the maintenance and operation budget comes from two different sources, technically three if you consider the federal government. We're going to leave that out for a moment, which means state and local dollars. So the state only funds about 48% of what the school district needs. The other 52% comes directly from local taxes. And so that's another complicating factor in all of this is local tax rate. And as property values go up, everyone complains that their taxes are going up. When the reality is your taxes aren't going up, your property values are going up, and therefore you have to pay more in taxes. And what the state is supposed to do is they're supposed to fill in that gap. And that is also a giant question when it comes to school funding is the state going to fill in that gap when property values go down? Now, my point in sharing all of that is that school districts have to take all of that into consideration. They have to take into consideration the amount of money they're taking in, which are revenues, and the amount of money that they're spending, which is expenditures. And when obviously you don't have enough money to operate, well, what some families do is they dive into their credit cards. What school districts do is dive into their fund balances, which is kind of like a savings account, but it's a savings account that school districts use when there's times of crisis, when they have to pay their teachers and they can't, when they need to build new buildings and they put money away if they can't pass a bond. So that fund balance is there. It helps with their credit rating. It helps with their bond rating. It helps with so many things. And school districts across the state have been dipping into their fund balance. Keller ISD is no exception. Their fund balance has been nearly depleted, and that's the reason why their Moody's rating has gone down. That means it's going to be more difficult for them to build buildings and get bonds because the school district doesn't have a mechanism in place to pay off that debt, or at least right now. So they need something in place to sort of build back up that fund balance. But another thing here that I think is real important to note is what school districts generally do when they're faced with this kind of financial crisis, which is not new for school districts in Texas. This is going back to 2010 when there was a financial crisis because of the recession. When school districts go through this, generally what they do is they look for other ways to mitigate their expenses, meaning sometimes they have to make some very difficult decisions. For example, take Louisville ISD. Louisville ISD went through some very difficult decisions recently to close some of their existing schools, and they did that because of financial reasons and for enrollment reasons. And that's really hard for a school district to have to make that decision. Enrollment is not just enrollment, but attendance is the bread and butter of a school district. When students come to school, school districts get paid by the state. But when your enrollment and your attendance goes down, that means less money for operating. So school districts have to make very difficult decisions. What they end up usually doing is cutting staff, closing schools, looking at consolidating and closing out some of their programs that they have in their schools. They might look at some of the contracts that they have and try to cut some of those funds. They encourage teachers to retire if some of their higher paid individuals in the district, if they can somehow encourage them to retire, that helps save some money. They also look for ways to cut in health care and insurance and some of the building and maintenance expenses. They encourage people to cut off the lights when they're not in the room so they can save on energy bills. They tell people to stop using printers and stop using copiers and cut back on using paper. These are just cost-saving measures that school districts have to do. They sometimes combine librarians, call them media specialists, and make them split schools. They'll do that with counseling. They might cut nurses. They might cut custodians. So this proposal to split the district into two separate entities, two separate existing school districts, it raises some questions. It's an interesting and innovative approach, but it's certainly something that's new, hasn't been done before, and is worth exploring. So let's take a look at some of the things that the Keller board is saying, the community is saying, and talk about the pros and the cons of possibly splitting up the Keller ISD into two separate school districts. Now, during the board meeting, one of the things that was done is the school district asked for a consulting firm to come in and sort of give some numbers and financial indicators for what it would look like if the school district were to divide in two. This group is called Moat Casey and Associates. They are a school finance consulting firm out of Austin. They do a lot of work in school finance, helping school districts with their budgeting. They also do some lobbying and support to try to help people understand this very complicated thing we call Texas school finance. So a representative came to the board meeting and sort of threw up some slides and drew up some numbers for what it would look like if the district were to split into two. So I think Moat Casey was faced with a kind of a daunting task to try to give some numbers to sort of indicate one way or the other whether this would even work for the school district. One thing that came out of that presentation was that even with their own financial analysis, it was kind of limited. They didn't have a lot of information. They didn't know what the expenditures would be, what the staffing would look like. They have an idea of what the tax rate would look like, but even then, it's a little unsure. And most importantly, that bond debt. There's money that is being spent on your debt service, and Moat Casey didn't really know who that would go to, which district would assume that debt. So it was very difficult to make some projections on what it would look like financially to have two different school districts. But one thing they were able to say was that their financial analysis actually concluded that it would be a near equal split from one district to another when it comes to the money that they would generate in their revenues. So through all of their slides and their presentation, one thing became clear, that even with a split, it would be almost an equal wash. It looks like both school districts would kind of get the same amount of revenue. It was difficult to determine, though, because like I mentioned, the debt service wasn't there, the expenditures weren't there, capital assets weren't there, like who's going to own certain things, especially large, very expensive items. So despite their best efforts, I think it was very difficult for Moat Casey to determine whether or not this is a financially conceivable idea to split both districts. There's just a lot of information that's lacking here, and I think a lot more information that they would need to conclude that this would be a good idea financially for both districts. So just a lot more information here would be needed by Moat Casey. Now, another common argument that's being made is that it's easier to operate a smaller district or a small district. I want to talk about that for a minute because there are lots of small districts across the state of Texas. In fact, there are more small districts than there are large districts. Texas has a lot of rural, very small schools. In fact, The Texas Education Agency actually has a definition for what a small school district looks like, and basically it's any school district that has less than 1,000 students. Through this proposal, the new school district, or the East Side School District of this new Keller ISD, would have around 9,000 students. That still classifies them, the Texas Education Agency, as a mid-sized suburban school district. But smaller isn't always better when it comes to running a school district. There are large, very well-run school districts in the state of Texas, and there are small, very well-run school districts in the state of Texas. There's no real clear indicator that being small or being mid-sized or being large really has a genuine impact on student achievement. You might actually have more purchasing power when you're a larger district. You have the ability to negotiate better insurance rates. You also have the ability to negotiate better contract rates when it comes to some of the resources that you provide. You have more purchasing power when you're a larger district. When you're a smaller district, it actually costs you more money. In my classes, I've talked about this all the time, is that Texas is the perfect model for a lack of efficiency when it comes to school districts. There are over 1,200 school districts in the state of Texas. That means 1,200 superintendents, 1,200 athletic directors, 1,200 HR departments. So efficiency is kind of lost when you get smaller and smaller and smaller. Sometimes being large scale is better when it comes to running and managing a school district. So the concept behind being smaller isn't always great. There are plenty of examples of smaller school districts throughout the state of Texas that have struggled, and they struggle because they lack resources. And because of the nature of the way things are funded in the state, and the way property values work, and the way taxes and recapture works, and this complicated school funding formula, sometimes being a smaller school district comes with some real small district problems. And I think by splitting up the school district into two different entities, you're developing a different set of problems than you would have had if you remain a standalone district as you are now. For example, Marlin ISD, which is just outside of Waco, about maybe 30 or 35 miles, is a small district with some rural components, and they have struggled for a very long time due to a lack of resources, good teacher recruitment, and some difficult leadership decisions that have really hurt the district. Now, they're on the up and up. Their trajectory has changed, but they are an example of a small district where TEAs actually had to step in and go, we need to reset things, we need to relook at your budget, we need to change the way that you are doing things in your district because student achievement is being lost. So being smaller isn't always a great thing, particularly in Texas, because sometimes you're just trading larger problems for smaller problems, literally. Now, this Keller ISD thing is going to be an ongoing saga. They're going to meet again in February, and I'm going to watch, and I'll keep continuing doing these updates. But because I do these videos primarily for my class, and we teach leadership classes here, what I want to make sure that my students understand is that from a leadership perspective, there are some definite leadership challenges that this school district is struggling with. For example, Keller ISD lost their superintendent during the midst of all of this change and this turmoil, and they had to appoint an interim superintendent at their board meeting. That makes their third superintendent in 4 years. That kind of creates a leadership deficit. When you have a leadership void, that creates its own unique set of challenges and problems, particularly in leadership theory that we talk about in our classes when it comes to mission, vision, climate, and culture, which are the four main things to help set the standard for where the school district should be going. So there's going to be some challenges moving forward with a new leader that's right now just an interim. A second set of challenges here is we have a relatively new school board. The school board just recently turned over in the last couple of years, and school boards are made up of public citizens, and most of the time these public citizens really don't know the ins and outs of school business and the way schools work. So they have to rely on the experts in the school business to help them make their decisions that are sound for the best interests of students and the best interests of teachers. And I know that's not always easy. When you step into that role, you become a public servant. And by being a public servant, now you've got a huge spotlight on you from the community to make the best decisions in the interest of the community and in the school district. So as this school board learns and grows together, I think they're being faced with some difficult challenges, and maybe the suggestion to divide the school district should be put on pause for a little bit until they learn a little bit more about the financial impact, the community impact, and most importantly, the student achievement impact that a split could have in the school district. Now, since this all broke on the internet and through school boards, the community has been very, very interested in the future of their school district, and there has been a lot of conversation and people coming out to voice their concerns, either for or against the split, in their board meetings. So in the last two board sessions, it's been about an hour and a half to 2 hours of public comment of people being very, very passionate, one way or the other, about where the school district should go with this decision. So I think community involvement is great. It's one of the things we talk about in class. We want to make sure that we have an involved community to help us be good stewards of the education that we're providing for students. But in this situation, because there are so many passionate voices, I think it would be helpful to take a step back and really evaluate that public commentary and make sure that all voices are being heard in one way or another, so that we can express our opinions, but also do what's best for kids and best for teachers. I used to tell my teachers that all the time. If it's not good for students and it's not good for teachers, we don't do it. So that might be a really good guiding question that could be asked here as they continue to pursue this innovative idea. And last but not least, to kind of sum all of this up, clearly Keller ISD and other school districts across the state are having some financial troubles and some turmoil. And because of that financial turmoil, perhaps it might be in the best interest of the district, before they make any major decisions, and I would say this about Keller, and I would say this about any other district, is that before you make any big decisions, maybe we should let the legislative session play out and see what's going to happen with school funding. Maybe the basic allotment's going to go up. Maybe teacher salaries will go up. Maybe there'll be more funding for pre-K. Maybe that $4.5 billion will finally get pushed forward out to the school districts like it's supposed to. These are some of the things that are being proposed right now. If these things were to come to pass, that's great news for school districts. Now, more funding is coming and more support and resources and help are on the way. So perhaps maybe take a step back. Let's let the legislature play out and see what's going to happen with school finance moving forward before making any financial decisions. And then once those revenue numbers finally come in, then call back your consulting firms, your chief operating officers, and start putting together a plan of what does this truly look like financially once all the numbers come in after the 2025 session. With that, I appreciate you listening. We'll keep touch on what's happening at Keller ISD. I'll keep doing these breakdown videos, and I appreciate you. So again, as always, take care of yourself and each other, and we'll see you soon.